The rain had stopped only minutes before dawn, leaving the jungle steaming as if the earth itself were exhaling after a long night. Every leaf glistened, every branch dripped, and every patch of soil felt soft enough to swallow a man whole. The air was thick, heavy, and alive with the quiet, nervous hum that always came before a fight. On a small ridgeline overlooking a narrow stretch of battered coastline, 14 American Marines knelt in that humid darkness, checking their rifles under faint shafts of grey morning light. 14 men, spread across barely 40 yards of broken ground, facing a Japanese force that reconnaissance estimated at more than 500. The numbers didn't make sense, they didn't add up on paper, and they certainly didn't favor the Marines crouched behind fallen logs, shattered palms, and mud-soaked sandbags. But wars are not fought on paper. They are fought by men with grit, fear, instinct, and whatever scraps of courage they can carve out of the chaos. These 14 Marines belonged to a reconnaissance combat patrol operating ahead of the main invasion force on a Pacific island whose name would one day be carved into monuments, though very few would remember the handful of men who began the fight that morning. Their orders had been simple: advance down the ridge, probe enemy lines, identify fortifications, and withdraw before sunrise. But nothing in the Pacific ever went as planned. The patrol had descended the ridge in darkness, their boots slipping in mud, their helmets slick with rain. They moved slowly, stepping around roots and craters left by weeks of naval bombardment. The Japanese had dug themselves deep into the island's interior, hidden beneath layers of jungle and soil. Their trenches were invisible from the air and nearly impossible to spot from the ground, until a man was close enough to see the muzzle of a rifle glowing faintly like a dark eye in the earth. Sergeant Lewis Harker led the patrol. A quiet, broad-shouldered Marine from Missouri, he spoke little, listened much, and rarely showed the strain that living through 2 years of island combat placed on a man's soul. Before the war he had worked in a lumber mill. After 3 invasions, 4 firefights that lasted through the night, and the loss of half his old platoon, he had become something else. A man forged under fire, steady as bedrock, and trusted by everyone around him. And now, he was the one who had to decide whether 14 Marines could hold against 500 Japanese soldiers moving in the pre-dawn dark. The plan had unraveled soon after the patrol reached the valley floor. They discovered a network of trenches far larger than expected, deep enough to conceal entire platoons, reinforced with logs and steel and connected in jagged, twisting lines. The Japanese had been preparing for a large attack. What the Marines found wasn't a forward outpost or a picket line. It was the leading edge of a massive defensive pocket. Sergeant Harker immediately ordered his men to fall back toward the ridge to relay their discovery. But they had barely begun retreating when the first shots cracked through the dark. Rifles, machine guns, mortar tubes thumping somewhere beyond the trees. The Japanese were already on the move, and they had spotted the patrol. The Marines scrambled up the slope, bullets snapping through vines, slicing bark from trees. Grenades detonated behind them, throwing dirt and splinters into the air. Harker shouted for his men to move, pushing them to gain higher ground where the foliage thinned and the slope offered some cover. But 14 men do not outrun 500. By the time they reached the crest of the ridge, Japanese forces had spread across the valley below, forming a sweeping arc of movement. Shadowed figures slipped through the undergrowth. War cries echoed in the humid air. The rising sun cast long beams of gold through the canopy, illuminating glimpses of bayonets and helmets. There was no escape, no retreat, no reinforcements. Only 14 Marines on a ridge and an army climbing toward them. Sergeant Harker dropped behind a fallen palm trunk, raised his binoculars for a brief glance, and saw what he feared most. The Japanese force was larger than even the reconnaissance reports suggested. Far larger. This wasn't 500. It might be closer to 600 or 700. A full infantry assault element moving to crush what they likely believed was a major American position. But all they would find at the top of that ridge were 14 tired, rain-drenched Marines. Harker lowered the binoculars. His voice was calm, too calm. "Dig in, spread out, they'll be on us in minutes." No one questioned him. They didn't have time. They slammed fresh magazines into their rifles. They wiped mud from their muzzles. They positioned their bar gunner in the center where he could deliver the heaviest suppression. They placed their 2 grenadiers along the flanks. Ammunition was divided evenly. Water was checked. Each man chose a place to die that morning because none of them expected to live through what was coming. Private Mills, the youngest at just 18, swallowed hard and asked the question none of them wanted to voice. "Sarge, do we really hold here?" Harker didn't turn. He simply scanned the slope where movement rustled through the vines. "If we run," he said quietly, "they'll overload the whole line behind us. If we hold," he chambered his rifle with a steady click, "we slow them, maybe stop them long enough." "Long enough for what?" Mills asked. Harker finally looked at him. His voice was steady as stone. "Long enough for someone else to live." The answer settled on the men like a weight. 14 Marines understood exactly what that meant. They were not fighting for themselves. They were fighting so the thousands of men preparing to land on the beaches behind them wouldn't be slaughtered by the very enemy now crawling through the trees. They were the shield, and they would stand until they couldn't. A low rumble carried through the valley, not thunder, not artillery, voices, hundreds of them, a rising chorus of shouts, commands, and rhythmic stomps through wet earth. The Japanese were moving in coordinated waves, pushing through the undergrowth with terrifying discipline. Harker raised his hand. Every Marine steadied their breathing. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Then a rifle shot cracked. It struck a tree inches from Private Alvarez's head. Harker dropped his hand. "Open fire." The ridge erupted in flame and thunder. Muzzle flashes burst across the line as the Marines unleashed everything they had. The bar spat a blistering stream of .3006 rounds, sweeping the slope with deadly precision. Grenades arced through the air, detonating among the leading Japanese ranks. The sharp crack of M1 rifles echoed through the trees. The Japanese staggered for a moment under the sudden onslaught, then surged forward in waves. They came fast, sprinting uphill with bayonets flashing. Their officers shouted commands as machine guns opened up from behind them, hammering the ridge with fire. The air filled with smoke and dirt. Vines shredded under bullets. Palm fronds exploded in bursts of green shrapnel. The 14 Marines fought with the discipline of seasoned veterans. They aimed carefully, fired only when targets appeared through the leaves, and shifted positions constantly to avoid becoming predictable. The bar gunner, Private Jack Merritt, became the anchor of the entire defense, his weapon vibrating violently as he mowed down entire lines of attackers pushing up the slope. But for every man they dropped, more appeared behind him. The Japanese had numbers, a sea of bodies advancing with relentless momentum. They fanned out, trying to flank the ridge. Some crawled on their stomachs, others zigzagged through foliage, others charged openly with wild cries, trusting momentum and shock to break through. Corporal Hansen on the left flank shouted a warning. "Right side, they're moving right." Harker pivoted instantly. "Mills, Harper, shift fire, keep them off that ridge." The 2 Marines swung their rifles and unleashed bursts toward the flanking group. Leaves snapped and branches splintered as their shots forced the Japanese to dive behind rocks and stumps. But the pressure didn't stop. The seconds stretched, the minutes thickened, the air turned hot with gunfire, the ridge became a storm of smoke, mud, shouts, and explosions. And the Japanese kept coming. A mortar shell struck 10 yards from Private Alvarez, blasting him off his feet. Dirt showered the line. Harker crawled to him, dragging him by his collar behind a mound of roots. Alvarez groaned, shaken but alive. The mortars came again. 1, 2, 3 explosions marched closer to the Marine line as Japanese spotters zeroed in. Harker shouted to the radio man, "Call artillery." But the radio crackled with nothing but static. Rain had soaked the last functioning battery. They were alone. Another wave of Japanese soldiers charged. Grenades flew from both sides. One landed between two Marines, but Private Harper instantly kicked it away, the blast ripping a crater in the earth where he had stood a moment before. "Merritt," Harker shouted. "On it," Merritt roared, swinging the bar toward the charging line. He fired in long, sweeping bursts. Bodies fell, others stumbled. The attack faltered again, but only for a moment. Those behind pressed forward, stepping over the fallen, shouting as they climbed the slope. A Japanese officer with a sword raised high appeared through the smoke, rallying his men. He charged directly up the center. Merritt fired at him, but the rifle jammed. The bar clicked uselessly. Harker didn't hesitate. He rose from behind his cover, aimed, and dropped the officer with a single round. The man's body slid down the slope, sword clattering across the rocks. "Fix that gun, Merritt," Harker shouted. Merritt cursed, slammed the bolt back, cleared the jam, and resumed firing. The ridge became a brutal test of endurance. The Marines fired until their rifles grew hot. They swapped magazines with hands slick from mud and sweat. They shouted warnings when Japanese grenades arced through the air. They shifted positions endlessly, each man covering for another. Minute after minute crawled past. 5 minutes, 10, 15. The Japanese had expected to break the ridge in under 3. Instead, 14 Marines had stopped their advance cold, inflicting staggering casualties and forcing officers to reorganize for new assaults. But the Japanese weren't finished. Far from it. They regrouped behind a line of shattered palms, and new shouting echoed across the valley. This time the war cries were deeper, louder, fueled by anger at the delay. Harker heard it and felt something shift in the air. "They're going all in," he said quietly. On the far side of the slope, movement surged. Mills shouted, "Sarge, they're massing again." Harker gripped his rifle tighter. "Then we hold until the last round." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Because the next attack would decide everything. The entire Japanese line surged forward at once. Hundreds of them, charging up the ridge, screaming, firing, throwing grenades. The ground shook under their footsteps, the air tore with bullets, smoke swallowed the jungle. And 14 Marines braced for the moment that would become legend. As the attack reached its peak, the true test began. 20 minutes had passed. 2 minutes remained. The ridge exploded with noise as the second Japanese assault crashed into the Marine line like a tidal wave of fire and steel. The ground trembled under the weight of hundreds of boots. War cries rolled up the slope in a rising storm, echoing off trees and rocks, merging into a single, primal roar that seemed to vibrate the very air. Harker steadied his rifle, exhaled slowly, and fired into the mass of shadows rushing through the smoke. His shot dropped a soldier who had broken ahead of the others, but another instantly filled his place, and another, and another. The wave seemed endless, unstoppable, driven by fury and momentum. Merritt swung the bar back into position now that it was running clean again. He braced it against the roots of a felled tree and opened fire, the weapon bucking aggressively as he held it steady. Long arcs of tracers sliced through the rising sun, cutting into the center of the Japanese line. Bodies fell in rows, tumbling back down the slope, but more climbed over them without hesitation. "Left flank," Mills shouted, firing rapidly. "They're pushing left again." Harper and Mills shifted their fire, emptying their clips into a cluster of soldiers who had managed to crawl halfway up the slope under the cover of smoke. 2 Japanese grenades landed near the Marine line. One rolled harmlessly into a ditch. The other lodged itself beside a tree trunk and detonated with an explosion that blew dirt into the faces of the nearest Marines. Private Reynolds, crouched behind the same trunk, felt a shockwave slam against his helmet. He shook his head, wiping his eyes clear, then resumed firing, each shot controlled and efficient despite the tremor in his hands. The Japanese continued advancing in dense groups, firing wildly. Bullets tore into branches overhead, sending splinters raining down. A round struck the ridge's exposed rock and ricocheted sideways, grazing Corporal Hanson's shoulder. He winced, clenched his jaw, and kept firing. "Merritt," Harker shouted, "shift right, they're breaking through the center." Merritt swung the bar toward the center and hammered the slope with controlled bursts. The weapon roared like a living thing, kicking up dirt and smoke as rounds tore into the advancing wave. 2 Japanese soldiers leapt forward with bayonets raised, screaming. The bar found them before they were halfway up the slope. But the sheer number of attackers meant others were always close behind. Mortar rounds began falling again. The first one exploded near the left flank, throwing Mills backwards. His helmet flew off as he crashed into the mud. Harker rushed to him, grabbing him under the arms, dragging him behind a small mound of tangled roots. "You with me?" Harker demanded. Mills groaned, eyes unfocused for a moment. Then he nodded, wiping the blood from his forehead. "I'm good." "You stay down a second," Harker ordered, "then get back on that line." A second mortar exploded, even closer this time. A third followed. Japanese spotters had triangulated the ridge and were walking the rounds closer and closer to the Marine position. Private Alvarez crawled forward, panting heavily. "Sarge, we gotta move or these mortars will bury us." Harker shook his head. "If we move, they push straight through to the main line. We stay." "But we can't." "We stay," Harker repeated firmly. Alvarez swallowed, nodded, and slid back into position, raising his rifle as another wave of Japanese soldiers rushed toward them. Harper fired rapidly until his rifle clicked empty. He ducked to reload, fumbling for another clip. His hands trembled. He forced himself to steady them, slamming in the new magazine with a hard snap. "Harper up," Merritt called. Harper popped back up, firing again. The next seconds blurred into chaos. Bullets tore through leaves. Grenade blasts shredded brush. Screams echoed up the slope as Japanese soldiers closed to within 20 yards. Some charged straight up the center, ignoring casualties driven by momentum and fierce determination. Others crawled low, using the slope's uneven terrain to inch closer. At the far right, Private Dawson shouted, "They're almost on the rocks, I need help." Harker turned instantly, Carter with him. Carter sprinted to Dawson's position, skidding behind a rock outcrop just as 2 Japanese soldiers lunged over it. Carter fired point blank, dropping them both. Dawson fired at another attacker who had flanked the rock. His shot hit the man in the chest, sending him tumbling backward down the slope. But the attack didn't stop. If anything, the pressure increased. A Japanese NCO with a pistol and sword charged up the center, shouting commands, rallying the second wave behind him. Harker fired twice. The NCO stumbled but kept coming. Merritt swung the bar and fired a 3-round burst that cut the man down. Still they pushed forward. Still the ridge held. But the Marines were running low on ammunition. Harker knew it, every man knew it. Clip after clip fired, grenade supply thinning, Merritt's bar barrel radiating heat. The Marines were firing faster than their pouches could keep up. "Ammo check," Harker yelled. One by one, the Marines shouted back. "2 clips, a 3, 1.5. Last box in the bar." The ridge was burning through its last reserves. and the Japanese seemed only to increase in number. They reached the halfway point of the slope again. Harker could see their helmets bobbing behind the rocks. Rifle barrels flashed through the vines. The Japanese opened fire from multiple angles. Bullets smacked into the logs, snapping branches and peppering the Marines with fragments of bark. Harker moved swiftly, checking the line, directing fire, shifting positions. His calm voice cut through the chaos like a steel anchor in a storm. Merritt, short bursts only. Hansen, watch that left rock. Dawson, don't overextend. Every order was followed instantly. The men trusted him completely. Another mortar exploded directly behind the line, showering them with dirt. Mills flinched as a fragment tore across his sleeve, but he didn't drop his weapon. Alvarez threw his last grenade, sending 3 soldiers sprawling down the slope. Private Reynolds shouted in warning, "They're grouping center again." Harker rose just enough to glance over the log. His stomach tightened. The Japanese had committed a fresh wave. Dozens more soldiers poured out from behind the lower tree line, running uphill with bayonets gleaming in the sunlight. Officers shouted commands. Drums beat somewhere behind the formation. War cries rumbled across the valley like rolling thunder. This was it, the main push. Harker took a deep breath. His voice rose above the chaos. "This is our ground, hold it." The Marines answered with fire. Merritt fired the bar in short, lethal bursts. The riflemen timed their shots carefully, dropping attackers with precision. The grenadiers hurled their last explosives down the slope, filling the jungle with sharp cracks of detonation. A Japanese soldier reached the top of a rock near the center. Harker dropped him with a single round, but another instantly replaced him. Hansen shot the second. A third climbed the same rock, bayonet raised. Harper hit him mid-charge, knocking him backward. The assault was ferocious, relentless. Bodies filled the slope. Smoke thickened the air. The jungle shook with explosions and cries. And still the Marines held. 20 minutes had passed. 20 long, brutal minutes of fighting without pause. Merritt's bar clicked empty. He cursed, fumbling for his last ammunition belt. Harker slid beside him. "How many rounds?" "Maybe 30. "Make them count," Harker said. Merritt fed the belt, slammed the receiver, and resumed firing. But the Japanese were nearly at the ridge. Some crawled within 10 yards. Others sprinted through openings that the Marines struggled to cover. A grenade landed between Hansen and Reynolds. Reynolds dove forward, grabbed it, and hurled it back downhill. It detonated midair, showering the slope with fragments. "Reynolds, you're insane," Hansen shouted. Reynolds didn't answer. He fired again. The Japanese were now so close that the sound of their boots slapping the rocks became audible between shots. Their shouts rose, their momentum surged. It was now a matter of seconds. Not minutes, seconds. Harker glanced at his watch. 21 minutes. He didn't know how long they could hold. He only knew they would stand until the last man fell or the last round fired. A Japanese soldier appeared from the left flank, lunging at Harper with a bayonet. Harper fired, missed, and fell backward. Mills saw it and fired from a prone position, dropping the attacker inches before he reached Harper. On the right flank, Carter clubbed a charging soldier with the butt of his rifle. Dawson finished him with a shot to the chest. The ridge was now a brutal close-range fight. Bullets, bayonets, shouts, smoke. Every Marine fought like a man who had accepted death but refused defeat. Another Japanese soldier vaulted the rocks and landed in the center of their line. Alvarez tackled him, wrestling in the mud. The soldier swung a knife. Alvarez fought to control his wrist, struggling. Harker dove toward them and shot the soldier point blank. Then another soldier broke through. Then another. It was collapsing. The entire Japanese force surged up the ridge in a last, desperate push to overwhelm the remaining defenders. Harker shouted above the roar, "Final stand, hold the line." The Marines responded with one last burst of gunfire. But the Japanese were inside 20 feet. Inside 15. Inside 10. Then something changed. A sound. A deep, rolling thunder far louder than any mortar. The Marines froze for a fraction of a second. The Japanese did too. Then the jungle behind the enemy erupted in fire. Artillery. American artillery. 22 minutes had passed, and the first ranging shots from the main U.S. landing force finally struck the valley. Explosions tore through the Japanese ranks, ripping apart the concentrated waves that had nearly reached the ridge. Smoke and shrapnel filled the air, soldiers screamed and scattered, officers shouted and fell. The entire assault collapsed as sudden, devastating blasts hammered the lower slope. The Marines stared in disbelief. They weren't alone anymore. Reinforcements were coming. And the Japanese assault, the one meant to crush 14 men, broke apart under the rain of American shells. The ridge had held. Against numbers no one would believe. For 22 minutes, that would echo through history. The first American shells landed with a violent, concussive force that shook the ridge like an earthquake. The jungle below lit up in bursts of white-orange fire, each explosion tearing apart trees, trenches, and bodies alike. The Japanese assault line, just moments earlier a surging tide on the brink of overrunning the ridge, broke instantly into chaos. Soldiers who had been sprinting uphill now threw themselves to the ground or staggered backward in shock. Officers shouted orders that were drowned by the thunder of incoming rounds. Sergeant Harker blinked through the smoke and dust, unable to immediately process what he was seeing. One moment they were seconds from being overrun. The next, the valley below was a storm of fire and splintered earth. He felt the shockwave of a near-miss rumble through his boots and realized with a jolt of clarity that American artillery had finally found the Japanese concentration. "Keep your heads down," he shouted, though most of the Marines were already hugging the ground. The shells landed in tight groups, 3 detonations in rapid sequence, then another 3, then a long pause as spotters adjusted fire. The ridge miraculously sat just above the impact zone. Fragments hissed through branches below, but none of the rounds struck the Marine positions directly. Alvarez coughed, spitting mud from his mouth. "About damn time," he muttered hoarsely. Merritt, face streaked with sweat and grime, rolled onto his back and laughed weakly. "Could have used that 20 minutes ago." No one had energy to respond. They could barely breathe. Smoke clogged the air, dust coated their tongues. Their hands trembled, not from fear now, but from exhaustion and the sudden release of tension after fighting without pause. Harker pushed himself to his knees. "Eyes open," he ordered quietly. "They'll scatter, but some might try again." But it quickly became clear that the Japanese weren't regrouping. They were retreating. The artillery barrage pushed them back down the slope, forcing survivors to dive for cover or crawl into whatever trenches remained intact. The tight formation that had pressed the ridge so relentlessly was gone, shredded, broken, scattered across the valley floor. A long minute passed. Then another. The shelling subsided, replaced by the low rumble of distant engines, the sound of landing craft coming ashore and trucks grinding over sand farther west. Reinforcements. The lines were finally connecting. The Marines lay in silence for a while, listening to the last echoes of artillery fire. Slowly, painfully, they began to sit up, check weapons, and take stock of themselves. Harker ran a quick visual count. "Sound off," he ordered. One by one, voices answered. "Harper good. Mills alive. Carter here. Reynolds still breathing. Hanson, yeah. Alvarez present. Dawson hurt but here. Merritt bar still hot." The others answered in turn until all 14 accounted for themselves. 14 men. 14 still alive. Bruised, cut, burned, shaken, half-deaf, running on fumes. But alive. The realization struck Harker with unexpected force. His chest tightened. He had prepared himself for the likelihood that half his patrol would be dead before reinforcements arrived. He had steeled himself to the inevitability of loss. But now, hearing the battered voices of his men cutting through the smoke, he felt something swell inside him, something like relief and pride tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate them. He looked out over the valley. Corpses covered the slope in clusters, dozens near the rocks, dozens more sprawled across roots and vines. The Japanese force had been gutted. Hundreds lay dead or wounded, their assault halted entirely by 14 Marines who had refused to give up an inch of ground. Harper wiped dirt from his face. His voice shook slightly. "Sarge, did we just stop all of that?" Harker nodded slowly. "We did." Mills turned, eyes wide, staring at the carnage below. 14 of us. 14, Harker said. Nobody spoke for a moment. They didn't need to. The ridge was quiet except for the distant crackle of small fires and the soft groaning of the wounded in the valley below. The Marines didn't celebrate, they didn't smile, they didn't cheer. They simply sat in stunned silence, each man grappling with what had just transpired. Carter finally broke the stillness. "Sarge, was that really 20 minutes?" Harker checked his watch. 22, he said. Merritt let out a long breath, almost a laugh. "Longest damn 22 minutes of my life." No one argued. The adrenaline that had held their bodies upright was fading rapidly, leaving behind exhaustion so deep it seemed to seep into their bones. Their weapons felt heavier, their limbs felt like lead. Some leaned against trees, others lay flat on the ground, staring at the sky. But the fight wasn't completely over yet. Movement rustled near the base of the slope. Harker snapped back into alertness, raising his rifle, eyes forward. But it wasn't a Japanese counterattack. A small group of Marines emerged through the smoke, reinforcement scouts moving cautiously up the slope, weapons raised. They advanced carefully until they recognized the battered uniforms at the ridge crest. "Holy hell," one scout whispered. "You boys did all this?" Harker didn't answer. He simply rose to his feet, shoulders stiff but steady, and motioned the patrol forward. The scout shook his head in disbelief as he climbed. "We saw the bodies from down there, thought a whole platoon was up here." "Just us," Hanson said quietly. When the scouts reached the ridge, they stared at the 14 Marines with something bordering on awe. These were not fresh troops. These were men drenched in mud, soot, and sweat, faces streaked with blood, uniforms torn, hands trembling. They looked less like soldiers and more like survivors of a natural disaster. One scout approached Merritt, eyes fixed on the bar resting across his lap. "You fire that thing the whole time?" Merritt nodded, too tired to speak. The scout let out a low whistle, bars hotter than the sun. Harker stepped forward, status of the main line. "Landing force is pushing inland," the scout said. "Command wants this ridge secure. They told us to find out who held it." He looked out over the corpses below. "And now I see why they didn't believe the radio report." Harker frowned. "What report?" The scout wiped sweat from his brow. Someone must have gotten a signal through before your radio died. Command heard that a small recon patrol was cut off by a massive Japanese force. They thought the ridge had fallen minutes after contact. Harper snorted tiredly. Guess we proved them wrong. Reynolds leaned back, letting his helmet rest against the log. Wish they'd sent artillery sooner. They did, the scout said, but the guns had to reposition. You boys bought the time, all of it. The look he gave the Marines was something only those who understood battle could give. Respect earned not by rank or medals, but by endurance in the face of impossible odds. Reinforcements began pouring up the slope behind the scouts. Dozens of Marines fanned out across the ridge, securing positions, checking bodies, establishing communication lines. The 14 who had held the ridge were absorbed into a storm of movement. Medics moved between them, examining bruises, bandaging cuts, checking for concussion or shrapnel wounds. A medic knelt next to Mills, tapping his shoulder. "You okay, kid?" Mills nodded shakily, "Just tired." "You'll feel worse tomorrow." "Already do," Mills admitted. Another medic approached Alvarez, peeling back his sleeve to reveal the shallow shrapnel wound across his arm. "Lucky you didn't lose the whole hand." Alvarez shrugged. "Sarge told us to stay down, I listened." "Wish more Marines listened to orders like that," the medic said, tying a clean bandage around the wound. Dawson leaned against a tree, rubbing his bruised ribs. "We holding this ridge for good." "For now," Harker said quietly. "Higher-ups will decide the next move." "And us?" Dawson asked. Harker finally allowed himself a small exhale. "We rest." As medics finished treating them, the 14 Marines gathered loosely near the crest of the ridge. They weren't ordered to do so. They simply drifted together, drawn by shared exhaustion and the quiet bond that forms only between men who have stood side by side at the very edge of death. Below them, reinforcements cleared the slope, dragging Japanese bodies into rows, securing prisoners, searching for intelligence. The jungle slowly returned to life, birds calling hesitantly, leaves rustling in a light breeze, insects buzzing around patches of sunlight that pierced the thinning smoke. Harper glanced down the slope again. "How many you think we hit?" Hanson shook his head. "Doesn't matter. What matters is they didn't hit us." Reynolds nudged Merritt. "Pretty sure you got half of 'em yourself." Merritt smirked, then winced from a sore muscle. "My shoulder disagrees." Carter exhaled deeply. "Didn't think we were walking away from this." "None of us did," Mills said quietly. Harker stood slightly apart from the group, watching the valley. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were heavy with the weight of what had happened. He wasn't a man who chased glory. He wasn't a man who boasted. He carried himself with a quiet certainty built from experience, loss, and the hard truths of war. But even he couldn't deny the reality. 14 Marines had held back an entire Japanese assault force for 22 minutes. And in doing so, they had changed the course of the day's battle. Command arrived shortly after, 2 officers accompanied by a radio operator and a map sergeant. They climbed the ridge with stiff urgency, scanning the positions, counting bodies, and speaking in clipped tones. "Sergeant Harker," one officer called. Harker stepped forward. "Sir." The officer took a long look at him, then at the battered Marines behind him. "Reports said you were cut off and likely overrun." "We were cut off," Harker said simply, "not overrun." The officer surveyed the slope again. "Apparently not." He lowered his voice. "You realize you stopped a force that could have broken through our landing zone." Harker didn't respond. The officer continued. "If they'd hit our lines with that momentum, they would have torn into the beach. Hundreds of casualties." Harker remained silent, but the meaning wasn't lost on his men. You didn't just hold, the officer said. You changed the entire shape of the battle. He stepped back, giving the Marines a long look of respect tinged with disbelief. No one's going to believe 14 men did this, he said. Carter muttered, we barely believe it ourselves. Later that afternoon, as reinforcements solidified the ridge and secured the valley, the 14 Marines were ordered back toward the beach for rest and debriefing. They walked slowly, limping, leaning on one another, carrying rifles that felt twice as heavy now that the fight was over. As they descended the ridge, more Marines passed them on their way up, fresh troops who stared in shock at the battered patrol. That them, one whispered. Those 14, the ones who held the ridge. That's them. Respect followed them like a quiet, unspoken current. No cheers, no applause, just a deep understanding shared among soldiers who knew exactly what standing against impossible odds meant. By the time they reached the beachhead, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the sand. Medical tents bustled with activity. Trucks rolled past, carrying ammunition and supplies. Engineers rebuilt shattered defensive lines. Officers shouted orders. The war machine moved on as wars always do, absorbing the actions of individuals into the vast mechanics of strategy and movement. But for the 14 Marines, the world felt slower. Softer. Quieter. They found a shaded stretch of sand near the tents and sat down heavily, letting their rifles rest beside them. Their bodies hurt, their ears rang, their minds felt distant, but they were alive. After a long silence, Mills spoke softly. Sard. Harker looked over at him. Why us? Mills asked. Why do we make it? Harker didn't answer right away. He looked out at the water where waves rolled gently toward the shore. He breathed deeply. Because we stood, he said, and because we weren't alone. Alone, Harper echoed, felt pretty alone up there. Harker shook his head. We had each other, that's enough. The others nodded silently. Because in war, sometimes all a man has is the Marine beside him. And sometimes that's all it takes to stop 500. The wind shifted, the waves lapped quietly. The 14 Marines sat shoulder to shoulder as the sun dipped lower, each man lost in his own thoughts. But the story of what they had done had already begun to spread. It would travel through platoons, companies, regiments, through the island, through the fleet, through history, and it would grow into something more than a battle. It would become legend. 22 minutes, 14 Marines, 500 enemy soldiers, a ridge that should have fallen, and a fight that would be told long after the war ended.